everyone, my name is Dr. Cunningham. I'm going to be talking with you today about yoga, our history, and our future. Yoga has a very fascinating past, and I think I'm going to probably be sharing with you some things that are very interesting that you may or may not have known about yoga's history. So first of all, yoga is a very diverse and multifaceted path. The very first known reference to yoga teachings occurred in the pre-Vedic period, which was around 6500 to about 4500 BC, and this was during the Indus Valley civilization. Very little is known about this civilization because it did mysteriously disappear around 1800 BC. And the writings on yoga during this period focused really more toward a means of enlightenment and philosophical writings. Where we really see the emergence of yoga historically was during the Vedic era, which is about 1500 to about 1000 BC. And the evidence of yoga was found in texts called the Vedas. The Vedas are the oldest writings in existence and the most sacred books of Hinduism. And as some of you may know, Veda means knowledge or sacred lore. So yoga in the Vedas really looked at the investigation of the relationship between the universe, nature, God, and humans. So it really was focused heavily on philosophical and religious exploration. They have found writings in terms of hymns and rituals, theologies, and philosophies. It was also during this Vedic period that they believe Ayurvedic medicine began to emerge. Then we move into what is called and known as the pre-classic era, and this is about 500 to about 200 BC. This was a very interesting period because it's known as a period of systemization and cohesion of the writings of yoga. So again, this period is more coherent. It's a philosophical system of yoga that was set up during this period and began to emerge. Various schools of Buddhism and Hinduism and Jainism began to be more systematized, and a more coherent philosophical part of yoga began to emerge. This is also when Patanjali systematized the Yoga Sutras. So let's take a moment and talk about Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. Patanjali didn't create anything new in terms of yoga philosophy or conceptualization. What he did is he took pre-existing philosophical beliefs and traditional practices of yoga and he systematized them into a text called the Yoga Sutras. The Yoga Sutras are 196 aphorisms, and it's one of the most authoritative texts on yoga in our contemporary times. The sutras eventually were reified into one of the 6 schools of classic Indian philosophy. It also includes yoga's 8-limb path, which is very commonly taught and known in yoga circles today. The 8-limb path is also referred to as Ashtanga Yoga or Raja Yoga. This 8-limb path, as many of you know, is still very much in vogue in contemporary times, and it's used for both enlightenment and for healing. The yamas and niyamas are the first 2 limbs of what is the Eightfold Path. The yamas and niyamas are considered behavioral and ethical guidelines and just very important foundational practices related to yoga. The other limbs are things such as the asanas, pranayama, and then the last 4 steps move more into the reflective, contemplative, and meditative aspects of yoga and what they have to offer. So the Yoga Sutras were there were many major commentaries written between the 9th and the 16th century. But around the 12th century, Patanjali's Yoga Sutras began to decline. And by the 16th century, basically Patanjali's Yoga Sutras were virtually extinct. The Yoga Sutras were brought back to popularity around the 19th century by Swami Vivekananda, and they became regarded as the science of yoga and what he would refer to as the supreme contemplative path of self-realization. So, asanas, not like we have today, not at all, which is kind of a very interesting part of the history of yoga. What we find is that Patanjali discusses asanas, postures, by defining it in verse 46 of Book 2 as follows. The first translation is, asana is what is steady and pleasant. Translation number 2, motionless form is asana. And we'll come back to that in just a little bit. The Mahabharata and the Bhagavad Gita began to emerge around 500 BC to about 200 BC. So what is the Mahabharata? The Mahabharata defines the purpose of yoga as uniting the individual Atman with the universal, all-pervading Brahman. This text, or these texts, are an epic that is comprised of 100,000 stanzas of verse divided into 18 books. This text, the Mahabharata, was authored by Vyasa in the ancient language of Sanskrit, and if you can imagine, it was handed down by oral tradition originally. It is literally the largest literary text in existence. The Bhagavad Gita is part of the Mahabharata, and it consists of about 700 verses. It covers the laws and rules of yoga practice that focuses basically on enlightenment. And it's a story that is just basically a narration of a dialogue between Lord Krishna and Arjuna, between God and human, and guiding Arjuna as he navigates life and moves into different conflicts. And there is God guiding the process and giving us the tools and the strategies for how to basically navigate life. In the Bhagavad Gita, it introduces 3 prominent types of yoga. Karma yoga, which is the yoga of right action, Bhakti yoga, which is the yoga of devotion, and Jnana yoga, which is the yoga of knowledge. Then we move into the Middle Ages, which is about 500 to about 1500 CE, and that's where we see more of the emergence of Hatha Yoga. There are 3 classical texts of Hatha Yoga. One is the Hatha Yoga Pradipika. The second is the Shiva Samhita. The third is called the Jaranda Samhita. So let's take a moment and talk about the Hatha Yoga Pradipika. This was composed by Swatmarama, and it is a compilation of earlier Hatha Yoga texts. It focuses on physical purification, postures, breathing techniques that a person practices to achieve a higher state of consciousness. It also elaborates on things like the chakras, the nadis, the bandhas, the mudras, and so on. The Hatha Yoga Pradipika, which is interesting, outlines 84 asanas, but other scholars state only 16 postures are proposed, 4 of which were basically seated poses. There really was not a heavy emphasis on asanas as we know them today. Then we move into the Shiva Samhita, and this development was found to be around the 13th to 17th century. They have a hard time really outlining exactly these dates because so much of the texts that were written were deteriorated by age and so on. So they estimate around the 13th to the 17th century. The author of the Shiva Samhita, unknown. But it does focus on the idea that there is one eternal true knowledge and path to self-realization. So basically, various chapters of the Shiva Samhita address how do we waken the Kundalini? How do we purify the self? How do we find that path to enlightenment? So in the Shiva Samhita, It names 84 different asanas, but again, we are not anywhere near the asana practice that we see in a contemporary way, because only 4 of these postures are described in detail. So then we move into the Jaranda Samhita, and this is speculated that it emerged somewhere around the 17th century. The author is unknown. What's interesting is Jaranda means vessel. So this is a text that provides a step-by-step process, a step-by-step manual that focuses on practices that a person should do to purify the body and the mind for the sole purpose of self-realization of the soul. This particular text outlines 32 asanas for basically building body strength, but again, the objective was self-realization. Then we move into around the 15th to the 19th century. This is a very interesting period because this is a period that is known as the fighting yogis. So during this time, Hatha Yoga was promoted and basically used for purposes of prowess and strength. This is a time when yogis were militarized, and the trade routes in northern India were controlled by these militarized and wandering yogis, and the British had a very difficult time because they wanted control and dominance over these northern Indian trade routes. And yet the militarized yogis kept causing lots of problems for the British and for British commerce during this time. So what happened is that the British government actually banned these wandering and militarized yogis, and they were forced to settle in urban areas, and they had to literally resort to showmanship just to support themselves, and they became sort of spectacles in India, and people would just throw coins at them for being able to do acrobatic poses or having achieved certain cities, and they would do these kinds of performances. But the British government completely banned them from being anywhere other than these urbanized areas. So then we see things like these type of spectacles of yoga practices and asanas. Very adept asana practice, but really used in a way for the wrong purposes. So what happened is that the asana practice, Hatha Yoga practices, basically became associated with the homeless and the poor. Asana practices were considered by the British and by higher class Indians as inferior to worthier practices of yoga, such as meditation as a means toward enlightenment. So the British really pushed for more acceptable religious and yoga practices among Indians. Translated, that means meditation only. So then we start to see the spread of yoga during this era into other areas and other religions, such as Zen Buddhism and Sikhism and Jainism. There's evidence of meditation and yoga practices into these various different religious conceptualization. Then we have a little more moving into a westward bound yoga in the 19th and 20th century. In 1851, N.C. Paul published the Treatise on Yoga Philosophy, and these philosophical teachings came to the attention of an educated Western public. In the 1890s, then we see Swami Vivekananda, who was a Hindu Indian monk, toured Europe and the US. He was basically considered one of the first yoga teachers to disseminate the yoga teachings to the West and to Western audiences. However, he didn't talk at all about asanas. His focus was mainly a meditative and philosophical approach to the practice of yoga. The New England transcendentalists and intellectuals really embraced Swami Vivekananda's teachings on meditation and yoga. They really felt it resonated with their belief system, so it became much more popularized through this intellectual community and the New England Transcendentalists. Then we have the emergence of Paramahansa Yogananda. He arrived in the West around the 1920s, and Paramahansa set up the Self-Realization Fellowship, which I think probably many of you are familiar with, and his best-selling book, Autobiography of a Yogi, I think influenced an entire generation of yogis. Autobiography of a Yogi was a book that I personally read to become more interested in the yoga practices. So the culture, let's talk a little bit about the cultural and political influences. In the late 18th and early 19th century, the British pursued policies of conciliation towards the native culture of India. So colonial rule resulted in years of racism that basically implied that Indians were physically and racially inferior to whites. So what was this political and cultural influence? What happened as a result of the British rule over India was that with this conciliation period, what was decided was that the British and wealthy Indians were going to reappropriate Hatha Yoga and have it become a large product related to Indian nationalism. So there was this construction of the, quote, new Indian man, and it was designed to combat these stereotypes that Indians were inferior to the British. So during this physical culture era, what was happening is that fitness and exercise programs called physical culture became very, very popular throughout Europe and throughout the West. And due to the British influence in India, this physical culture phenomena became very popular in India. So physical culture was based on bodybuilding practices, gymnastics, and basically military calisthenics. So then there's the Indian physical culture that became very, very popular. So traditional Hatha Yoga practices, which were very minimal at this time, were combined with modern physical culture in an attempt to meld the indigenous Indian exercises with more Western practices and ideals. So basically what happened during this time is that a new, more aerobic and acrobatic version of yoga was formatted, and that was devoid of any military associations or showmanship. They were just shifting the whole concept of yoga into this physical culture template. So what happened was that Krishnamacharya was deeply embedded in the physical culture, and he was a highly influential person in the development of modern yoga. His financial backer, the Maharaj of Mysore, was also a physical culture enthusiast. As a result of this, there was this new blend of yoga that was developed that included bodybuilding, gymnastics, military calisthenics, and specific Hatha Yoga practices that were only deemed acceptable, that were included in this template. So a new physically oriented acrobatic form of yoga is what migrated to the West. And some of these styles of yoga that migrated were devoid of any spiritual or meditative practices. So this new form of yoga is what arrived in the US, in the West in general. Some of the most influential global teachers of the 20th century, Iyengar, began the development of his practice, Iyengar Yoga. Pattabhi Joy, the founder of Ashtanga Yoga. Desikachar, the founder of Vinaya Yoga. And Indra Devi, the founder of Hatha Yoga, and had a huge influence in Los Angeles, the Beverly Hills area. So these are some pictures of these very influential yogis, Iyengar, Pattabhi Joy, and TKV Desikachar, as well as Indra Devi. Her book on yoga for Americans was widely embraced in the early 20s and 30s and 40s. Some of the poses and sequences thought of as foundational to yoga today were truly only invented in the 1930s. So an example of that was the sun salutation. That is a venerated practice that all traditions of yoga practice, but in truth, it was the origins of the sun salutation came out of this physical culture phenomena that was happening. And the use of Sanskrit to define some of the poses was intentional, to make them seem like a part of the cultural tradition of yoga. The idea that contemporary poses are part of a 1,000-year-old tradition is really only partially accurate, because again, many of these poses were developed and became more cohesive under the umbrella of Krishnamachari's influence to 4 of his very globally influential students. Then we move into the 60s and 70s and the cultural influence of what was happening during the 60s and 70s. At the time, yoga was only considered a fad during that era. And the practice and interests mostly focus on enlightenment, expanding consciousness, out-of-body experiences, altered states of consciousness, LSD experiments, meditation, relaxation. Other influences to the West during this period of time was Richard Hillman. In the 1960s and 70s, he was very influential. Another very prominent tradition began with Swami Shivananda. He was both a medical doctor and he was the founder of the Divine Life Society. And he also influenced global teachers from this particular lineage, one of which was Swami Satchidananda. He came to the US in 1966 and he founded the Integral Yoga Institutes and Satchidananda Ashram, which is located in Buckingham, Virginia. His legacy was greatly influenced by the spread of therapeutic yoga and medical yoga, and also he promoted an interfaith movement. Swami Vishnudevananda was also someone who was very influential worldwide. He came to the US around 1958, and he founded the Shivananda ashrams worldwide, and he wrote the complete illustrated book of yoga. Swami Radha was also someone who came to the West, mostly focused in Canada, and she was the founder of the Yasudhara ashram. There are many people who were influential and brought aspects of yoga to the West. I'm not able to cover all of the individuals who came to the West, and here is a representative example of some of those individuals. So we have Yogi Bhajan, who founded the 3HO movement. He came to the US in around 1969, and he brought Kundalini Yoga to the US. Swami Muktananda came in around the 1970s. He's the founder of Siddha Yoga. Swami Rama arrived in the US in the 1970s, the founder of the Himalayan Institute of Yoga Science. Richard Alpert, Ram Das, as many of you know him by, became more prominent in the 60s and 70s, and he was basically a consciousness teacher. He's also the founder of charitable organizations such as the Seva Foundation and the Hanuman Foundation. And his best-selling book, Be Here Now, began, or I should say influenced, a whole generation of hippies who were really looking for something else, looking for a better way in life, so to speak. Baba Hari Das was another very influential teacher. He founded Mount Madonna Center, Ayurvedic school, pharmacy, clinic, and he really helped spread the teachings of Ashtanga Yoga in the West. During this time, in the 60s and 70s, we see the emergence of many ashrams, communes, intentional communities. They became very prolific during this time. As well, people made many pilgrimages to India to, quote, find enlightenment. There were many cultural shifts during this time, in terms of music, rock and roll, our dress, standards, feminism, women's lib, civil rights, the peace movement, all intersected with the West embracing yoga. So yoga became very much a part of this social, cultural shifting that was happening in the 60s and the 70s. There was the anti-establishment movement, the anti-war sentiments became more rampant among people who were socially active, protests, the hippie movement, and again, yoga became part of this counterculture. Also during this time, interestingly enough, there was academic and research circles that began to investigate the whole concept of the type A personality, related to biofeedback, relaxation, the effects of meditation. Dr. Herbert Benson out of Harvard was very influential during this time when he wrote his best-selling book called The Relaxation Response. And this began to impact and influence the movement of yoga, meditation into academia and into research circles. So then we move into what is called the modern yoga in the 1980s and the 1990s. Basically during this time, yoga, mindfulness, and meditation exploded into Western consciousness. Yoga rapidly moved into mainstream during this time, whereas before it was just considered a fad, now we have it moving more into mainstream in terms of medical yoga, therapeutic yoga. Many different types of teacher training programs began to develop during this period of time. And during this time, this is what's called the second generation of yogis began to emerge. In terms of the first generation being individuals like Prajabi Joy, Swami Satchidananda, all of a sudden now a second generation of yogis began to emerge. And this became known as the yoga boom in the 1980s. This second generation of yogis ushered yoga into Western consciousness like we have never seen a cultural phenomena happen. Very interesting because it seeped into healthcare, education, academia, research, hospitals, insurance reimbursement. It just was like a tsunami during the 80s and the early 90s. This is also when medical yoga and therapeutic yoga began to emerge. So just a moment to understand that the yoga that is taught to the general public is different from the conceptualization of therapeutic yoga for individuals who are struggling with some kind of illness or disease or need some kind of therapeutic application of yoga, whether it's physical or mental. During this time, as I mentioned, different teacher training programs began to just explode, and it became yoga for everything. Yoga for diabetes, for thyroid, for depression, for heart disease, for menstruation, for children with special needs. The list is basically endless in terms of how creative people became with the application of yoga into therapeutic use. So we see this amazing and fascinating cultural shift, again, of yoga being applied to just about everything you can think of. Yoga for anxiety, all sorts of psychological issues as well as physical problems, issues, disease, and so on. So there are a few pioneers that were influential. There are many, actually, pioneers who were influential during this period, but I'm going to highlight just a few. Barbara Brown, Dr. Brown, was the founder of the concept of biofeedback. She was a scientist and researcher and really brought the whole concept of biofeedback and relaxation concepts into the forefront of our thinking during that time. Jon Kabat-Zinn, of course, was very influential in bringing mindfulness-based stress reduction concepts into our consciousness, and just throughout the medical arena, much research being done on mindfulness practices for different applications of illness, disease, and just stress in general. And Richard Davidson, Dr. Davidson, out of the University of Wisconsin in Madison, began his studies about 40 years ago, looking at the application of mindfulness, meditation, and yoga and how it influences our neurobiology. So he's really one of the top researchers in the world looking at mindfulness, yoga, and meditation and what's happening in the brain during meditative and mindfulness states. And then, of course, we have Dr. Dean Ornish, who was highly, highly influential in impacting on and bringing yoga into mainstream medicine. He's the individual who did so much beautiful research on reversing and preventing coronary heart disease using a yoga-based model. And he got significant results over and over again with his research, again using a yoga-based model to see how it affects the atherosclerotic plaque in coronary heart patients, as well as other types of research on reversing and preventing coronary heart disease. So just phenomenal, and just continued to get significant results over and over again. So Dean Ornish, Dr. Dean Ornish, is a student of Swami Satchidananda, and as I mentioned, he basically thrust yoga into the forefront of medical treatment options with his absolutely groundbreaking research, again using yoga to reverse heart disease, and then also applied a yoga-based model to see the impact on prostate cancer and got very significant results with the same model. Because of this, several insurance companies, many insurance companies, became very interested in how they can use a yoga-based model to help with insurance costs. And then we see things like the Blue Cross Blue Shield of Pittsburgh company actually purchasing the Dean Ornish program. So this began a whole new area of this tsunami of yoga into healthcare, into insurance coverage, into research, into medicine. It's just been an amazing input into mainstream everything. So yoga, USA Today says yoga and vegetarian diet can heal your heart, and I guess if it says so in the newspapers, it must be true. But the truth is that it really did heal people's heart. Many, hundreds, if not thousands and thousands of people have benefited because of this groundbreaking research. So shifting a little, we have the expansion of yoga in many other areas. So we see the Yoga Journal that was established in 1975. Huge impact on bringing yoga practices and information to the public and to yoga teachers. The International Association of Yoga Therapy was founded in 1989, and the National Center for Complementary and Alternative Medicine literally became a national center in 1993 and included under the umbrella of the National Center for Complementary and Alternative Medicine. Yoga has a very prominent place under that umbrella in terms of research and clinical application. So let's talk for a moment about the International Association of Yoga Therapy, the IAYT. As I mentioned, in 1989, the IAYT was established. In 2007, they established what is called SITAR, the Symposium on Yoga Therapy and Research. In 2010, another symposium, an annual symposium, was established, and that's the Symposium on Yoga Research. Research in the area of yoga, mindfulness, and meditation just exploded and became so prolific during this time that it was thought we need to have a symposium on yoga research. So fascinating process and very, very informative conferences, both of these areas, the Yoga Research Conference and the Symposium on Yoga Therapy and Research. A very exciting moment happened in 2011, which was the International Journal of Yoga Therapy was accepted into PubMed. This is a very difficult thing to happen for journals, and the fact that a yoga therapy journal was accepted into that very prestigious medical arena was a very big deal. So very exciting moment. In 2012, the IAYT published and implemented the educational standards for training of yoga therapists. In 2015, training and certification in therapeutic yoga was standardized into an 800-hour certification training program through 24 certified schools. So we're seeing this amazing emergence of yoga therapy, the training, the education, the standards, and the certification through IAYT, just spreading through our culture in such an amazing, powerful, and beautiful way. In 2016, yoga therapy certification, the C-IAYT, was launched, and over 500 IAYT members were credentialed as yoga therapists. So that's a first, kind of a historical marking point. In 2016 also, the IAYT published the IAYT Code of Ethics and Professional Responsibility, along with a scope of practice. And currently, the IAYT board, I think, is looking at and reviewing a possibility of a specialized track to certify healthcare workers in therapeutic medical yoga. So it's a very, very exciting time. So as we talk about and look at yoga in the 21st century, since 2001, the popularity of yoga, particularly in the US, and I think everywhere really, but in the US, yoga exploded from 4 million practitioners in 2001 to over 36 million people practicing yoga in 2016. Yoga has also drawn support from many worldwide leaders. In particular, President Obama said, quote, "Yoga has become a universal language of spiritual exercise in the United States, crossing many lines of religion and culture. Every day, millions of people practice yoga to improve their health and overall well-being. That's why we're encouraging everyone to take part in PALA, the Presidential Active Lifestyle Award, to show your support for yoga and answer the challenge." During this period, we're also seeing yoga merge into healthcare. This is an amazing phenomena that has been implemented in the United States and hopefully will also move into other countries. The Brave Well Collaborative is a community of leading philanthropists who work together to transform the U.S. healthcare system and basically improve the health of the American public through the advancement of integrative medicine. So what we need to understand here is that yoga is under the umbrella of integrative medicine. It's a powerful technique, strategy, intervention under integrative medicine, along with mindfulness, meditation, healthy living, diet, all of those kinds of conceptualization. So the theme in terms of integrative medicine is yoga is a movement whose time has come. Integrative medicine is a movement whose time has come. So let's take a look at what is the Brave Well Clinic, what is their network, what does this look like? We see the implementation and the support from the Brave Well Collaborative, embracing, supporting, and helping to actually establish integrative medicine into a representative example into areas such as Boston Integrative Medicine, the University of Colorado, Duke Integrative Medicine, Jefferson Myrna Brin Center, the University of Maryland, Mount Sinai Beth Israel Center, Northwestern University, the University of California, San Francisco, Osher Center, and so on. We see this support and this movement and this approach and integration of integrative medicine into many, many different universities, medical centers, and hospitals throughout the United States. It's a very, very exciting time for yoga, mindfulness, and meditation as it merges with the conceptualization of integrative medicine. We also see the integration of yoga, mindfulness, and meditation and having healthcare workers embrace these concepts. So throughout academia now, you're seeing many, many initiatives in compassionate care, resiliency interventions, self-care, self-regulation techniques. There are many different healthcare workers, particularly nurses and physicians, who sometimes experience high fatigue and high burnout levels. So academia and hospital systems and university medical systems are really looking at this issue in terms of how can they use mindfulness, yoga, meditation to work with the whole concept of healthcare worker fatigue and burnout. And it's been a very, very successful launching of these types of initiatives into healthcare workers and into the hospital settings. So let's take just a moment and look at research related to mindfulness and yoga. In 2016, the National Institute of Health spent over $100 million on research related to mindfulness yoga practices. There is growing evidence-based research demonstrating that yoga is effective in reducing chronic low back pain, improving function, reversing heart disease, impacting on cancer, reducing heart rate and blood pressure, and relieving anxiety and depression. And this is directly from the National Institute of Health in the US. So this is just a representative example of some research studies that have been done utilizing mindfulness and meditation and yoga. So if you're interested, I would recommend that you check out the Center for Healthy Living at the University of Wisconsin. Check out their website, and you'll see a whole list of research studies related to and implementing mindfulness yoga and so on. So the result of all this research has been the translation into actual intervention and into academia and professional organizations. So many universities and medical centers have now established integrative clinics for people to come and have yoga, mindfulness, and meditation as part of their treatment option. Many professional organizations have also been created during this period. So we have the Academic Collaborative for Integrative Health, Academic Consortium for Integrative Medicine and Health, and so on. Just spreading in every direction as we move through into the 21st century. We also see yoga being implemented and used during commercials, and World Yoga Day. January 3rd, 2016, World Day was established by Prime Minister Modi of India to be held on solstice, June 21st of each year. And the first year that they had it, 2016, there were more than 1 billion people practicing and participating in yoga throughout 192 countries. So this is just a little pictorial of some of the practices that occurred during International Yoga Day in 2016. We also see meditation, mindfulness, again exploding into our culture and into our societies with all of these prominent magazines and journals looking at the mind and the mindful revolution in business, in law, in academia, in healthcare, in medical care. Bottom line, yoga has arrived, and it's not going anywhere. And what's so amazing and so beautiful is that because of the advent of new technology, we are now able to see so much more clearly into the brain and areas of the brain that are lighting up during yoga practices, during mindfulness, and during meditation. So the next new exciting frontier is looking at how we can use mindfulness, meditation, and yoga to heal our bodies in a very different way. Because once we begin to understand the neural pathways that are lighting up, once we can understand the neural connections that are lighting up and happening during our meditation practices, we can start to duplicate that process and influence our genes, our neurobiological process, and bring, I think, a much higher level of health, vitality, and wellness into who we are. Yoga has an amazing history, and it has an even more amazing future. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be here with you today and to share some of these ideas and concepts around where we've been, our history of yoga, and where we're going. So thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure.